There's nothing quite like a great E3 presentation, and with E3 2018 on the horizon, I thought it would be a perfect time to revisit one of the most memorable demonstrations in the history of the show, the E3 2003 demo of Halo 2. Looking back, 2003 was a rather pivotal moment in the life of the Xbox brand. After all, Halo was immensely popular, Xbox Live had just launched, and developers were finally starting to really take advantage of the hardware. And Halo 2 itself, well, it had already been announced via a cinematic trailer months earlier, so it's not surprising that Xbox fans everywhere were breathlessly awaiting its first showing at E3. Now, the game itself was still very early in development at this point, but in February of 2003, the team at Bungie set out to build this very E3 demo. The idea was to create something which would showcase many of the key objectives intended for the game, including an overhauled graphics engine, new gameplay options, such as dual wielding, and even new enemies like the Brutes. Expectedly, Halo 2 made a huge splash when it showed up in Microsoft's press conference, appearing as a one more thing right at the end of the show. I remember watching the live stream myself, and it was certainly a breathtaking moment. For E3 attendees though, Bungie demonstrated the game throughout the show in a theater with lead writer Joe Staten at the helm. The theater experience featured a highly Bungie-style presentation complete with simulated banter between Joe and Sergeant Johnson.
Just be sure that you guys are safe.
Stow it, son! These folks didn't wait in line to hear your lips flippity-flap. Knuckle up and get ready to dance, you pasty bastard!
Yes, sir, Sergeant!
But the real meat was the Halo 2 demo itself, and this is that demo. From the very first moment, it's immediately clear that Bungie's ambitions for its new graphics engine were running rather high. The bold colors and lighting immediately suggest a noticeable leap over the original game, but as we know, things didn't quite go as planned, but we'll get to that later. For this demo, the graphics engine used to build it was dubbed P-Stencil, or perhaps it's really just Stencil with a silent P, which would be a very Bungie thing to do. Either way, this engine focused on delivering two major shifts in real-time rendering, stencil shadows and normal maps. The latter, normal maps, made their way into the final game and are extremely common today. The basic concept involves adding surface detail using textures. The normal maps contain info about the direction each pixel is facing relative to a light source, thus giving the impression of additional depth. This armor here is a good example of that despite the rather low-resolution nature of the artwork. The normal maps give an impression of extra detail without using extra geometry. Stencil shadows, on the other hand, didn't exactly make the cut. Around this time, more developers were exploring ways to introduce high-quality dynamic shadows into their games. And thanks to hardware and software advancements, stencil shadows started to become a viable solution. This technique enables sharp, pixel-accurate shadows from dynamic light sources. And though it was still in development, Doom 3 was really the first big AAA game to really showcase a variant of this technique on a larger scale, and it seems that Bungie was following suit. Throughout the demo then, you might notice plenty of super sharp real-time shadows across objects and characters. Not every light casts a shadow, but plenty of them do, and it looks great. I'll try to point some of them out when they appear. But before we continue with the demo, let's briefly rewind and compare this introduction with a similar scene in the final game, just to get a better idea of how it's changed. After all, while the stencil engine may have been dropped, many of the assets remain. For one thing, while it may be flat, the gorgeous artwork featured in the E3 demo is replaced with this grimy brown texture work of a city. Of course, the city's actually modeled in this scene. As characters begin to appear, the difference in lighting is really noticeable. Everything simply appears flatter in the final game. Now, the finished product does still make use of normal maps, of course, but surfaces appear slightly muddier overall, which, combined with the flat lighting, kinda show their age. Back inside the Pelican, stencil shadows and more robust lighting are immediately evident in this demo version. The final scene is completely lacking any sort of self-shadowing on the character models in comparison. That said, the scope of the cutscenes is larger than in the demo. It's clear that the final game features more complex shots with additional scene geometry. You may have also noticed the texture and asset pop-in the final version. With the increased memory requirements due to reliance on normal maps and other texture layers, the final version of Halo 2 is kind of notorious for this. It's likely that the problem stems primarily from the rapid cuts in the cutscenes. The camera jumps around from scene to scene like a film sequence, requiring the Xbox to quickly load data into memory. From this point, however, the demo and the final game completely diverge and go in different directions. So let's just get back to the demo then. So instead of crashing like we see here in the final game, the Pelican lands gracefully in the demo version, complete with a really nice depth of field effect. With everyone on the ground now, the Chief leaves the Pelican, and we're given our first look at the battle rifle, which, as seen in this demo, is a single-shot weapon, like what would become the DMR in later Halo games. The battle rifle, as it would appear in the final version of Halo 2, is instead a burst weapon. Now, as Master Chief makes his way through an encampment, pay attention to the reliance on normal maps and shadows. Characters feature a lot of additional texture detail here because of the normals, while each of them casts a razor-sharp shadow, both on themselves and the world. Scene geometry is fairly simplistic overall, but it has a nice clean look that feels decidedly different from the city sequences in the final game. As we continue, notice that while characters and objects do cast shadows, this doesn't apply to scene geometry. As the light shines into this space, for instance, baked lighting is used rather than a dynamic light casting a shadow. At this point, it's interesting to sort of reflect on what we've seen in the sequence thus far. It's a tightly scripted stroll through a battlefield under siege. Now, there aren't a lot of scenes like this in the original Halo, but these concepts had become increasingly popular by 2003. Half-Life kind of kick-started the scripted storytelling technique back in 1998, but it was really games like Medal of Honor, Allied Assault, which really turned things up to 11, which is the same style that team would later use in the Call of Duty games. These days, these heavily scripted scenes feel a little tedious, but at the time it was amazing and really helped build the atmosphere. As the demo continues, we catch a glimpse of what might be an early implementation of Havoc physics, which would become standard for the series going forward. It's not clear if it was already implemented at this point, mind you, but the addition of extra objects influenced by external forces is certainly a nice touch. Then of course the Chief starts popping off shots with the single-shot battle rifle with a nice radio blur surrounding the weapon sight. Then as we close in on this soldier over here, note the shadow from his helmet casting across his face. And after this scripted sequence showing damage being done to the city by the Covenant weapons, pay attention to the razor-sharp stencil shadow below the character as he makes his way along the wall. Now we're given a full view of this intersection. Per-pixel spotlights combine with nice texture work to create a clean, attractive futuristic city, kinda like what we'd see years later in Halo 3 ODST. Elements of this certainly do survive in the final game, but it's much less brown in this demo version. But at this point you might be thinking, hey, this looks like Halo and it's gorgeous, so why was this impossible to achieve? Well, one of the reasons lies in the shadows. The stencil shadows used in this demo simply proved too expensive on a larger scale from what I understand. While this demo is real time, it required a lot of tricks and hacks to even run this well, and even still, there's loads of slowdown and tearing throughout. Apparently, Bungie even had to chop out large portions of scene geometry from the city map as well, just to get the frame rate where it is. The main issue here is that, while the scale for this specific section is reasonable, it's really dwarfed by many of the much larger maps in the shipping product. Halo 2 is all about large open maps, and it simply wouldn't have been possible to reach the desired level size using this approach to shadows and lighting. Thus, Bungie returned to light and shadow maps instead. Now, in the years after this demo, there would be other Xbox games with rich stencil shadows, including the port of Doom 3 and the Chronicles of Riddick, but both games focus on small maps in comparison to a Halo game. Okay, now as we continue forward with the demo, notice the dual SMGs here. The model and muzzle flash appear quite different from what we see in the final product, and lack any sort of recoil when fired. The single-shot battle rifle is great, but I kind of feel like the final game really improves upon these early SMGs. For this next scene then, we get a nice demonstration of the particles and effects implemented in this build of the demo. There's a nice mix of debris and laser blasts filling the screen here, before Master Chief eventually pokes his head around the corner, taking out the grunts in the process. While we're here, take note of the nice per-pixel lighting in this scene, which really brings out the texture in the wall. Oh, and there is that screen tearing, of course. And once this sequence is complete, the most impressive part of the demo begins. Well, after the Chief takes out these jackals at least. Yes, it's time for the Warthog run. So there's a lot of new stuff happening here. Firstly, AI can now drive the Warthog, which is a new feature that was planned for and would ship in the final game. I'm sure the AI behavior in this particular demo is quite scripted, but it is a cool feature nonetheless, even if it didn't always work reliably in the final product. Second, Chief is also seen using the Gauss cannon, which is another addition to Halo 2. So thus far in the demo then, it's been nothing but new weapons. Then there are the visuals. Aside from the spotty frame rate, I think this sequence holds up rather well visually. The street lamps, placed around the environment, each cast a shadow when you drive under it. The environment texture work also looks great, with a nice reliance on normal maps. The use of color and lighting is pleasing. There's the nice sun flare, which is similar to the first game, and really the whole thing just feels epic. Curiously, the current house of Halo, 343 Industries, apparently still has this old demo lying around, and it is playable, but it also highlights the unstable nature of such an early pre-release build. Each playthrough of the demo that was shown at E3 was slightly different, but ultimately it sounds like wandering off the beaten path results in either crashes or nothing of interest. So it's one of those things where it would be neat to see a proper playable release of this demo, but at the same time, it's not really something you'd get a lot out of. It's really just a curiosity piece, though honestly I feel like it belongs in a museum. Now, while this scene is not included in the final version of Halo 2, there is a similar battle taking place on the streets of New Mombasa. It even shares the same music track from this demo. Of course, right away it's clear that it lacks the advanced lighting of the Stencil engine, but in terms of environment complexity, it kind of feels larger. There's a higher density of tall buildings throughout this area, which help give the impression of a larger city, even if the street itself is relatively small. More than anything, I think it's the artwork which has changed the most and gives the impression that the game looks so different from this E3 demo. If we jump back to that demo then, this next scene is one of those crowd pleaser moments. A brute drops from an enemy ship and knocks you off the Warthog, complete with excellent shadow work and animation. It's one of those epic scripted moments, but it kinda suggests that enemy interaction with player vehicles will be increased compared to the original Halo. Then of course the Chief blows up a car, which is something else we've seen throughout this demo. It's basically increased destructibility, and it does apply to the final game. This is then followed by the famous boarding sequence, in which the Chief commandeers a ghost being driven by an enemy. This is a feature that would make it into the final game of course, but I'd imagine pulling it off at this stage in this particular demo was rather tricky due to the reliance on scripting. The ghost itself also features enhanced environment mapping and a more vibrant overall color palette that does look similar to the final game. But this short sequence is used to set up the finale, a gorgeous cutscene used to tease the game. This sequence gives us a closer look at some of the vehicle and character models used in the demo, while also sort of teasing the lengthy bridge sequence, which, while quite different, would actually appear in the final game with you driving a tank like this. This cutscene also highlights the improvements to animation being attempted with Halo 2 for its cinematic sequences. The original game is somewhat basic in that regard, but Halo 2 really manages to ramp up the quality of the cinematics, and this does apply to the final game despite the noticeable pop-in. Taken together then, it's not difficult to see why Halo 2's E3 presentation remains one of the most revered in show history. It's a perfect blend of cinematic action, new mechanics, beautiful visuals, and a powerful soundtrack, and it kind of felt like a big surprise all around. Of course, we now know that the demo was created specifically for the show, and it was decided shortly after E3 that the entire Stencil engine had to be dropped due to hardware limitations. Bungie's ambitions were simply too high, but it's not something they've shied away from discussing, which is kind of refreshing. It would have been easy to simply never speak of the demo again, but instead, Bungie has remained open about the situation. At the same time, in 2003, we didn't really know that it wouldn't be possible, and this demo certainly suggested that the Xbox still had some tricks up its sleeve. Keep in mind that Half-Life 2 debuted at E3 2003 and Doom 3 was still making the rounds. That Halo 2 could, at least in some ways, keep up with cutting-edge PC games in development felt like a dream, which I suppose it kind of was. So what of the final game then? Well, Halo 2 has its fans and detractors, but for me, it was a wonderful game, and I do feel that Bungie still produced an excellent campaign with solid multiplayer to go along with it. The core mechanics are simply perfect, and the level design, though less attractive than this demo, still looked remarkable for its time. Perhaps one day I'll do an entire episode of DF Retro on the game. Now, since 2003, there have been other infamous demos throughout the years, each with their own stories, but Halo 2 remains one of the most fascinating. And of course, Bungie was no stranger to this type of demo either. A similar situation occurred with the original Halo. Before they were purchased by Microsoft, they demonstrated a very different looking game running on the PC at E3 2000, and before that at one of the Macworlds. At least the Halo 2 E3 demo resembles the final game, whereas this original Halo demo really doesn't share a whole lot with the final product that would launch in the Xbox. So what do you guys think? Do you feel that Halo 2 managed to live up to expectations? What were your thoughts at the time? Were you even born when Halo 2 was announced? Let us know in the comments below. That's all for now though. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and ring the bell, since in its current state, the YouTube subscription feed needs some additional coaxing. If you want to reach out and discuss the video though, you can find us over on Twitter as well. But until next time, this is John, signing off.
Roger, Recon. Your call, Sergeant.
We're going in. Get tactical, Marines!
Covenant ground forces own this city. We'll need to deal with them before we can kill that cruiser.